Good morning, everyone. First of all, let me thank you all. Let me thank the organizers of this wonderful conference and also Eileen, Sandrine, and Alan for inviting me to take part in this roundtable on motherhood, domesticity, sex, and citizenship. After Wollstonecraft, the relationship between motherhood, domesticity, and women's citizenship has been a cornerstone in the 19th century public debate, also in the United States. We all know that with the Declaration of Independence, the United States had affirmed the interdependence between republican freedom and empire. However, it was in particular in the first half of the 19th century that they strengthened their imperial vocation in an expansionist territorial project that resulted in a war of extermination against the Indians and also contributed to the expansion of the peculiar institution of slavery. A particular analysis deserves the contribution of 19th century women reformers to the debate on the construction of the American empire because of their peculiar condition that has been identified as related to the separate spheres. Indeed, the rapid industrial growth and the simultaneous process of democratization that under Jackson's presidency expanded suffrage to include almost all white American men accentuated the division between what historians have defined as separate spheres of activity between men and women, each characterized by its own specific gender-based role. On one hand, the public sphere, exclusively dominated by men, and on the other, the private and domestic sphere, assigned to women. The relationship between women and the public sphere was therefore mediated by father and husbands, who acted as legal guardians. However, combining what were considered to be the spheres of female responsibility, such as motherhood and care activities with leading roles in philanthropic associations, white middle-class women expanded the sphere of domesticity to community activities and gradually began to act as public subjects. Let's see how they did this by considering the case of two pioneers of white American reformism, Margaret Fuller and Lydia Maria Child. I can't go into details now, but for those of you who don't know them, I'll just say that there were two 19th century women reformers, journalists, and activists from the Boston area. Fuller is well known for her book Woman in the 19th Century, that was published in 1845 and is considered to be the first American feminist manifesto. On the other hand, Child is mainly known for her abolitionist commitment as editor of the National Anti-Slavery Standard, which was the most popular abolitionist newspaper in the US, and also her book An Appeal in Favor of That Class of Americans Called Africans, that was published in 1833 and is the first anti-slavery work printed in America in book form. My focus today will be on the different ways in which Child and Fuller conceived the concepts of motherhood and domesticity in relation to women's involvement in the public sphere, in particular regarding the expansion of slavery throughout the continent. Let's start with Lydia Maria Child. Before being known as one of the most important American abolitionists of her time, in 1826 she had founded a periodical for children, the Juvenile Miscellany, that through short stories, poems, and puzzles provided amusement and imparted moral lessons to northern white middle-class children. Like most children's periodicals in the 19th century, the Juvenile Miscellany had an important place in the process of nation building. It had the social mission of providing behavioral models to the people of tomorrow, helping children to become honorable members of the American Republic by transmitting middle-class virtues as frugality, industry, temperance, self-denial, and perseverance. A more in-depth reading of the magazine reveals that among the numerous contributions dedicated to the moral education of young readers, after 1830, an increasing number of child stories refer to slavery and contain an abolitionist message. The exclusive presence of women in the editorial staff of the Juvenile Miscellany illustrates how the emergence of American children's literature in the 19th century was strictly connected to the political ideology that viewed women as Republican mothers. The strategic importance of children's literature gave the women who created it considerable political power as producers and reproducers of the nation's values, as Child herself wrote in 1828 to Catherine Maria Sedgwick. I quote from Child: I have thought much lately, almost to agony, of the fearful responsibility of one who writes for young people. Who can calculate how far the influence of a single story may spread throughout the community, and how much it may have to do with closing or expanding young and active minds to the influence of truth in afterlife? Child anti-slavery stories in the Juvenile Miscellany reveal the means available to female abolitionists to make their voices heard within 19th century social restrictions based on gender. What could be more domestic than producing stories inside the household to be read by mothers to their children within the home? By educating young minds in a republic that had declared that all men were born equal but had kept in slavery that class of Americans called Africans, to quote the title of her most famous book, Lydia Maria Child fits into the tradition that Deborah De Rosa has called domestic abolitionists, a group of women authors that, by taking advantage of the cult of motherhood and childhood, used juvenile literature as a means, I quote De Rosa, to transcend the ideology of separate sphere and enter into the public discourse about slavery to which they had limited access. Through abolitionist literature for children, women like Child and Sedgwick could act as moral agents in the domestic realm, the appropriate place the ideology of separate spheres assigned them, and work within what was considered the private space to reform society. Writing children's literature about slavery thus allowed women like Child to circumvent the controversy over women's public involvement and to operate undisturbed within a grey zone between the public and the private sphere. The second case I would like to mention is that of Margaret Fuller. While through the Juvenile Miscellany Child emphasized women's roles as Republican mothers, on the one hand Fuller stressed women's roles as wives, but on the other also as independent public subjects. Published in 1845, Woman in the 19th Century is one of the founding texts for the women's rights movement in the United States. Here Fuller inserted her vision on the role of women in contemporary American society that moves away from the cult of domesticity as conceived by Child. According to Fuller, since women were prevented from free access to the professions and therefore from full economic independence, marriage was considered, I quote, the natural means of forming a sphere, of taking root on the earth. That was why women were subject to social pressure to marry. If they were really free to choose, Fuller argued, they would have decided to remain single or to postpone marriage in order to dedicate themselves to the development of their intellectual and spiritual faculties. In most cases, according to Fuller, marriage proved to be the place where the man could exert all his power over his wife, a space where the woman experienced the deepest inequality, lived in a condition of dependence, and could be compared to a slave. Although Fuller recognized the fundamental role of mothers as the first educators of children, she believed that the educational process of the children could not be carried out properly until the woman was recognized full equality within the marriage institution. Marriage, wrote Fuller, was the biggest mistake for a woman because at present it turned out to be, I quote, a seal of degradation, because it guaranteed her fewer rights than she enjoyed when she was unmarried. With marriage, a woman gave up her right to own property, to raise children in case of divorce, became the property of her husband, and from every point of view became as an adopted child. Fuller pointed out that women, as moral agents, had at the same time the right and the duty to influence politics and to take their stand against the American expansionistic project of slavery in two ways. First, by privately influencing their husbands. Second, in public, through the organization of meetings in the whole country. I quote from Fuller's book. Might not we women do something in regard to this Texas annexation project? I have never felt that I had any call to take part in public affairs before. But this is a great moral question, and we have an obvious right to express our convictions. I should like to convene meetings on the women everywhere and take our stand. So Fuller pointed out that until then she had not felt responsible to enter the public debate. Her legitimacy to act by urging other women to challenge the conventional separation of spheres was given by the fact that the issue of slavery was a moral question and could therefore be included within the scope of women's concern as moral agents and as wives. So, to summarize, we have seen that the relationship between motherhood, domesticity, and women's public roles is very complex and has divided women reformers also in the United States. For example, Child, for much of her life, emphasized women's roles as Republican mothers, promoted through her words the separation of spheres of competence between men and women, and helped shape a vision of domesticity that, by focusing on the role of women as mothers, would officially keep them away from the political world and let them work within the home to reform society. On the other hand, Fuller was since the early 40s a radical critique of the separate spheres. Underlying the state of subjection that women experience in said marriage, she claimed the participation of women in politics, that on the one hand involved women's role as wives and their domestic spaces of influence, but on the other hand, by using the concept of domesticity, she crossed the male dominated public sphere and contributed to shape a new female public sphere informed by women's values as moral agents that involved matters excluded from male party politics. So, thank you very much for your attention. And if you have any questions, do not hesitate to contact me at my mail address serena.mochi@unibo.it. Thank you again.